You remember the story. We don't know how long he had been sick for. We don't know to what extent people had gone to try to help him or assist him. When the story begins to be told with us, it's bad enough that his sisters now send word to Jesus. Your friend is sick. And when word comes to him, Jesus is out teaching. Opposition had arisen, and Jesus is out teaching with his disciples. And his disciples know how close Jesus is to Lazarus, and so they assume that Jesus is immediately going to make his way back. They'd seen him heal so many. Surely this power, this healing power that had been given to strangers, gifted to people who were sometimes rebellious, sometimes who doubted, surely this healing power would now at least be directed at one that he greatly loves. And yet Jesus surprises his disciples. He comforts them in a way in which he says that basically this isn't going to be the end of Lazarus. And so they take a bit of comfort from that. But he doesn't immediately go back to Bethany. Instead, he waits a couple of days. And the intention is he's going to get back, but he gets busy. And there's so many things that are going on. And word once again is sent to Jesus. But this time the word is not that Lazarus is sick. This time it's that he's gone. He's dead. The disciples are overcome with grief. And Jesus once again comforts them and says, Lazarus, he's just fallen asleep. And they think it's literally that he's just fallen asleep. They don't realize that Lazarus is actually dead. But Jesus says it's time for us to go. Let's make our way. But in order to make their way, they're going to go through an area in which Jesus has been avoiding. They're going to go through an area where people want Jesus dead. And Thomas. Doubting Thomas, the one that everybody looks down upon, Thomas in this moment shows a great deal of faith when he says, let's go die with him. Words of courage. Words of bold belief that I'm willing to literally risk my life now. And so they make their way. And Mary and Martha are at home where Lazarus has died, been in the grave 4 days. And when he's still kind of a little bit a ways out, you can hear maybe the crowd that Jesus is getting close. And so Martha goes out to meet him. And as she approaches Jesus, she's overwhelmed with grief. And she says, my Lord, had you only been here? It's a mixture of faith and anger. It's almost a passive aggressiveness. Like, I'm not accusing you, but I'm accusing you. And yet it's wrapped up with this great sense of trust and belief that I know that you have a power that none of us can explain. And had you only been here, like you were there for everybody else, had you just been here for the ones that you loved, my brother wouldn't be dead. Jesus basically says, you don't think I can do anything now? And Martha with this great sense of faith says, anything is possible. And Jesus says, your brother's going to rise again. And Martha, once again, having been raised in the faith, knows, I know that a day is going to come in which the resurrection is going to happen. Jesus says, you don't get it. I am the resurrection and the life. Well, meanwhile, Mary, the sister, is back in the house. Martha had the faith to rise up out of her grief and to come out and to greet him. To come out in a psalmist sort of way to at least let him know of her anger, and yet in the end to still tell of her faith. Lazy bum Mary had no time for him. It's too late. So Martha goes back to the house and says, hey, Mary, the Lord's here. Mary rises up and goes out to see Jesus. And we don't know if the tone was the same. We don't know if the meaning was the same, but the words are the same. Lord, had you only been here, my brother would still be alive. And then Jesus works this amazing miracle where he raises Lazarus from the dead. The people are overwhelmed. They're overcome. They're amazed in that moment. They're so overwhelmed by everything that's going on that Lazarus is standing there, kind of captured in his burial clothes, and Jesus is the one that has to say, "Would somebody get him loose from that?" And they take off the burial clothes. And we don't know how much time has passed. But Matthew kind of tells his story in a different sort of way, and Luke tells his story in a different sort of way, and Mark tells his story in a different sort of way, and John tells his story in a different sort of way. So in Luke chapter 10, Luke tells the story from a little bit different angle. He tells about the celebration. And so Martha and Mary are so overcome by what Jesus has done for them that they now want to honor him. They want to throw a party now in his name for what he has done. And so they invite Jesus over, and we don't know who else is there, but we're certain that there are probably other people that are there. But Luke kind of picks up the story midway through. And the picture that we get here is Martha is now in the kitchen. She's preparing. Very similarly to the way that many of you are going to prepare this week. It's a big meal. It's a big task. You got to plan days in advance. You got to figure out if you only got one oven, which one are you going to use and how are you going to use it, and everything's got to work just exactly on a specific schedule. And Martha is in there slaving away. Maybe in part slaving away in hopes of making up for her lack of faith. I look at the story as a time in which she exhibited extreme faith in horrific times. But it probably didn't feel that way to her. It probably felt like she had disappointed Jesus. Let down her brother, let down everybody else. She was so close. Had she just been cool, calm, and collected and strolled out and seen Jesus and said, "Well, I'm glad you're here now. Only you and you alone can take care of this. My brother is dead, but you can raise him back to life." That would have been faith. She didn't have that. I look at her as having far more faith than what we would have had, but she probably, whenever she looks at herself in the mirror, she probably seems an extreme failure. And now maybe she wants to make up for it. Maybe she wants to get the attention of Jesus to say, "See, I'm not as bad as you think I am." She wants this meal to be perfect. And it's probably in part who she is. She's probably the servant kind of type. She's the worker bee kind of type. She's the type that is constantly giving of herself to assist other people. That it's possible that maybe that's where she draws her identity. Maybe it's eased over into a sinful kind of nature to where she doesn't get her character and her identity and her value from what God says about her. In part, maybe she gets it from the service, maybe from the accolades of what everybody else says. It's an identity issue that's going on. But there she is in the kitchen. She's trying to get it all together, and it's not coming together the way she wants. And anytime things begin to go in a direction we do not want them to go, we find somebody to blame. It's never fully our fault, never fully our responsibility. And while we feel shame over what we have done, we can always pinpoint it. Had somebody else done what they were supposed to, had they just done what they were supposed to as athletic director, we wouldn't be in this problem as a coach. And for Martha, the blame was her sister, Mary. She wasn't in the kitchen. Her hands weren't sore from kneading the bread. She wasn't covered in flour. She hadn't stained her nice dress that she had worn to honor Jesus. Where was Mary? Mary was in the kitchen with the boys. Mary was in the living room with the boys, not the kitchen. Wasn't time to eat yet. So Mary was being lazy. And you can almost feel it. You can almost sense it. Maybe she was tenderizing some meat and she was doing it with a greater force every single time. because her sister wasn't in there. She could hear the cackling in the other room. She could hear the laughter because Jesus was there. And it was a time of celebration. It was a time of enjoyment. He was teaching, and there is no doubt that there were people moved to tears in the moment. But Jesus had this ability to create laughter at the same time. There was a sense of levity. There was a little bit of relaxation. If the other disciples were there, they had been running for some time, afraid, knowing that the time was going to come in which their lives were going to be demanded of them. But maybe this was just a moment in the moment to relax. And maybe they were telling the stories. Oh, you ought to have heard what happened over here, and you ought to have seen the look on the face whenever Jesus said this, and you won't believe what happened here. Telling their traveling tales. Meanwhile, Martha's the only one working. And finally, she's had enough. And then the text describes her well. It says she was distracted by so much serving. And that's all where her focus was. Her fixation now was on everything that she had to do. And without the help that she wanted, and the help that she needed, it finally reached a boiling point. And she burst into the living room. And she quietly invited Mary back into the kitchen to have a conversation, so she could calmly and coolly tell her side of the story, to hear Mary's side of the story, to understand why the differences were so far apart, so that they could come to a good resolution, so this meal could move forward and their relationship would be uniquely bonded together in Christian love. Okay, that's not what she did. She burst through the kitchen, and notice, she didn't even talk to her sister. She went to Jesus. Wow. Going there, are we? You can't come and talk to me face to face. You can't even talk to me face to face even if he's still in the room. You're going straight to him. And this almost sibling kind of rivalry kicks in this moment where Martha bursts in the kitchen and says, "Hey, Daddy, there's something wrong here." And she goes to Jesus. And notice what the text says. Notice what happens whenever we're distracted by even good things. Notice what happens whenever we lose our sense of identity of who we're supposed to be, when we're operating out of shame, trying to maybe earn the favor of God in a way that we can never earn the favor of God. Whenever we begin to blame other people for our problems, notice what happens. She walks in and says, "Jesus, do you not care what my sister is doing? Do you hear it? This is a man who wept at the death of Lazarus. This is a man where the text says was deeply troubled at the grief of these sisters. This was a man who we know left the joys and the privileges of heaven and came down to this earth, taking on the very nature of a servant, became obedient to death, even death on a cross for our sin. And Martha now has the audacity, not just to question his action, not just to question his thought, not just to say, I have a differing opinion and I don't understand what you're thinking. She has the audacity to say, do you not care? It's an attack on his heart. It's a question of his integrity, of his character, the very essence of who he is. It may be the easiest part of the story for us to relate to. When things don't go our way, we formulate that person that is to blame. And then we dehumanize them. It allows us to justify our actions, whatever they may be. It allows us to feel better about ourselves as we castigate them off to the side. And it's such a go-to kind of play that Martha even uses it against Jesus. Thankfully, Jesus is not like us. Had I been Jesus in that moment, I would have said, oh, you want to question my heart? Let's talk about you for a moment. Let's go down to your list for a moment. Let me talk about everything I've done for you, every place I've been for you. But Jesus is unmoved in that moment. He's not overwhelmed. His anger doesn't rise within him. Instead, compassionate, loving Jesus, as he is sitting there laughing and talking and teaching, turns his compassion, not his anger, his compassion toward Martha. Now think about Martha in the moment. Martha says, Jesus, do you not care about my sister? She's going to him in this moment wanting her sister rebuked, wanting his next words to be, oh, Mary, Mary, get in the kitchen. It would have made her feel better. It would have validated all her service. It would have validated all her concern, all her fear, all her worry, everything that's going on internally within her. If she could just get this man now to validate her, it would all be worth it in the rebuke of her sister. Oh, there's something powerful about that, isn't there? As fun as it is to be accoladed ourselves, if you got a sibling kind of rivalry, sometimes it's more fun to see your sister get in trouble than it is for you to be praised. I'm still convinced that if I put a piece of candy out between Ella and Silas here, while they both want the candy, what they want more is for their sibling not to get the candy. Martha and Mary have that kind of relationship, it's possible. And the only thing that's going to make Martha feel better, she thinks, is for Mary to be rebuked. So she burst in and says, Lord, do you not care what my sister is doing? And then she stands back. My work is done here. For a moment, I'm going to get to rest as our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ rebukes my sister and maybe sends her to hell. Oh, y'all don't think that way? Okay. Y'all don't want LSU to get probation? Come on. Can you imagine Martha's response when the first word she hears from Jesus is, Martha, Martha? It's a repetition. It's a repetition we've heard before. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. It's a technique that Jesus uses, and he uses it whenever he wants to show that there is a deep spirit of concern. It's not a pattern he uses in the midst of tremendous joy. This is something has gone horribly wrong here. This is my mama saying Kevin Allen. And she thinks for a moment maybe he got the names mixed up. You know how that happens. Mama never could call me by the right name. She'd have to go through the whole list until she finally got to me. And so, Mary's the youngest one. And so it probably happened a lot where somebody was calling out for Mary and said Martha. And so it could be at the first that she thought to herself that Jesus had just made a little mistake. Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled over many things. And it pierces her heart. Hear the words of Jesus there. And I don't hear them from anger. I don't hear them as a sharp rebuke, a cutting rebuke of a how dare you come after my heart, I'll show you. I see it from a rested, connected, engaged Savior. Unmoved now by the sin of somebody else, unmoved from that, he has compassion, yet he's moved in compassion because of the consequences of her rebellious actions, but he's not moved in anger or frustration, or I don't even think here disappointments. It's just a compassionate word of, I see your heart here. You are anxious and troubled over many things. this distraction, this idea that you've taken your eye off of that which matters the most, this now fixation on this dinner, this fixation possibly on trying to earn my favor, this fixation possibly on trying to overcome what you feel is a failure of your past, to try to even the scales in some way, as if you can do this fixation now on the sins of your sister, this distraction has created within you an anxiety, a troubled spirit. It's interesting, that's the same word that was used of Jesus whenever he was at the graveside of Lazarus, whenever he saw the grief of these women, that his spirit was troubled. But that was an understandable trouble. It was a trouble because of the sin of this world, because of the consequences of our own rebellion, because of the heartache and the grief of people that he loves. But now Mary in this moment has created a trouble that she didn't need to create. She is restless when she could be rest-filled. She is blaming others and attacking others and feeling isolated when she could, in this moment, come into the living room and be loved. All because she is distracted by what she thinks she needs to do, possibly in order to earn the favor of God. Ed said in preaching meeting this week that there may not be anything worse than trying to do everything in your power to get the attention of God and then not getting it. He saw Martha now as this very quintessential kind of picture of a religious person in today's society, doing a bunch of things in hopes of earning God's favor in a way that they can never earn God's favor. It's something that you have to receive. And Jesus now calls out to Martha, "You're anxious and troubled." Now notice, this is not a rebuke of anxiety in general. This is not a rebuke of being in trouble. This is not the idea of you should never be troubled. It's not that. Jesus illustrates within his own life that there are times in which the realities of life are so overwhelming that it does create an uneasiness within us, an uncertainty of what's going to happen next. There are these times in which we should be deeply troubled. But there are times where we shouldn't. And here Jesus says it doesn't have to be this way. You are so caught up in all this other stuff. It doesn't have to be this way. And then he does the worst thing that he could possibly do. He says, in this instant, you need to kind of look at your sister. She got it right. Now this isn't an ultimate, you got to be careful about this. This isn't an ultimate kind of concept of Mary's always right, Martha's always wrong. It's not that at all. It's in this moment, in this sliver of time. Kids, if you ever hear your parents saying you need to be more like your sibling, it's just in this one frame that is actually true. There's 1,000 other frames where that's the last thing you ever need to be. But in this one moment, Jesus says there's only one thing that really matters, and your sister has chosen the right portion. It's a double kind of meaning there, this right portion. In the immediate context, it's a reflection of the meal. The portion would be what you get at the meal. I've come for my portion, my fill of what's going on. And what Jesus is saying is, in this moment, Mary has chosen the right meal. She's being nourished in the right way. Man should not live on bread alone, and Mary has recognized that. And Martha, you should have done the same. It's also a reference back into the Psalms. The Lord is my portion. He's enough for me. And Jesus says to Martha, there's another way here. It's an invitation out of this anxiety, out of this troubled kind of spirit. But in order to get there, Martha is going to have to overcome what I think is the greatest distraction in life. And that is our fixation on other people. We're fixated on them. We're constantly comparing ourselves, comparing the work that we do to the work that they do, comparing the outcomes that we get to the outcomes that they get, comparing our heart to their heart. We're constantly looking at, God, what are you doing with them, and what are you not doing with them? And this isn't fair here, and they deserve far less here and far more punishment there. And we're so fixated on other people and what is going on that it's a distraction away from God himself. And that distraction now leads to an anxiety. It leads to a kind of troubled spirit. And notice here in this moment, in this one scene, that we have this beautiful contrast of the whole series that we've been in so far of rested, connected, and engaged. Then you have Martha, who's distracted. She is disengaged now from those things that are truly important in life, and that has exhausted her. Because she's on this treadmill now of trying to please God in a way that God can't be pleased, by her own effort, by her own energy, in a way that I'm going to even the scales. That's not how we are made right with God. And it's exhausting to her. And that weariness finally bubbles up enough that she feels isolated, disconnected. And whether or not that is true or not, she then makes it happen by accusing her sister, by pushing her sister away, pushing Jesus himself away. And here you have Martha exhausted and isolated and distracted. And the byproducts of that is she is now dehumanizing Jesus, dehumanizing her sister, and not even recognizing probably in part her own inability and her own need. And Jesus looks at her and says, it doesn't have to be this way. Now, there are some of you in this room who you are greatly anxious and highly troubled. And there are pressing issues coming down on your life. And if Jesus were speaking to you today, I literally think that all he would do is to simply weep alongside of you, recognizing your pain and your sorrow and the struggle of this day. But for the vast majority of us in this room, while there are bad circumstances and situations that we don't like, for the vast majority of us in this room, we have chosen to be anxious and troubled because we are distracted by good things, but distracted nonetheless away from the one thing that matters. This connection with Jesus. Getting our source and our identity solely from him. Allowing him to set the perspective of this world and what it is and what it's all about. And Jesus, with compassion today, is calling out to us. Kevin, you are anxious and highly troubled. It doesn't have to be that way. There's an invitation to a different way. There's an invitation away from the chaos of this world, away from the isolating techniques of pushing other people away and blaming them, a different way from this distraction, these things that you are chasing. And he invites us to him. And now, don't misinterpret this passage. Guys, on Thursday, don't sit in the living room and watch football all day while your wife's slaving away in the kitchen. And whenever she says, hey, can I get some help? You say, no, I'm just being Mary in here. And wives, if he does that, then you tell him, oh, I'll make you Mary. I'll make you single, poor, and living with your sister if you keep that attitude up. Don't look at Martha's sin here as being that she worked. That's not her sin. Think about it. Had Martha just truly trying to been serving Jesus? If she wasn't trying to get her identity and her value from this, and she just wanted to serve him, to honor him as now her spiritual act of worship, if that's just what she wanted to do, her heart and her attitude would have been radically different. And even if she felt overwhelmed by the task, she might have walked in the kitchen and said, hey, here's what I would like to do. Can somebody help me? But she wouldn't in that moment allowed her anger to rise up, to begin to define her. She wouldn't in that moment had to have everything perfect. She would in that moment been able to just order some pizza and listen to Jesus. It's not what she was doing here. For some of us, the last thing that we need to do is less work. There's a good number of us who need to work harder, who do need to serve God more, who the distraction that they have faced is a distraction of apathy, a distraction of sloth, and you need to allow the Holy Spirit to convict you and to condemn you in that moment, and now to find a different way and to serve God in a meaningful way, by no means trying to get your identity from that, but by in no way using Mary as a justification of your own laziness. But there's also a good number of people in this room who, as you serve, you need to watch out. Whenever you begin to feel it rise up within you that, man, everybody else should be doing what I'm doing, you're crossing a line. Whenever it begins to rise up within you of, God, do you not care about me? Aren't you going to punish them? You're crossing the line. You see, it's an amazing thing about this, that you can't serve people you're judging. You just can't. Not in a Christian sort of way. Now the government can do that. We can do that from a political sense. We can do that from a human sense. We can pretend to be helping people even as we're condemning them and judging them, but not from a Christian concept. To truly serve in that I'm going to now love you the way Jesus has loved me, we can't be ripe with judgment toward them. Now we can understand that choices that they're making are wrong, but only in the same context that choices I make are wrong. But you can't truly serve those that you're judging. And so as you do your work, as you make your effort, you also have to begin to guard your hearts. I wonder, what are your Martha moments? Where from an outside perspective, everything looks pretty good. But if anybody truly knew your hearts, your service is almost in vain. I wonder, what are your Mary moments? Something that the world will look at and say is so pointless. Notice what Martha is saying here. She's doing nothing. I'm in here working. She's doing nothing. And Jesus says, she ain't doing nothing. She's doing something. She's literally receiving now from God himself. The world would look at this as pointless. What are you doing here today? You're just wasting time. I mean, this is Thanksgiving week. There's a lot going on. It's going to be a beautiful day out there. All the places and things you could be doing right now. This is just a waste. But not from God's perspective. If your heart is right, if you're hearing, if you're listening, if you're here to grow and to learn and to connect, you've chosen the one thing that matters. And yet notice, your outward activity can be right. And yet if you're just up here singing in order to check a box or to earn God's favor, if you're just up here preaching trying to get God to like you, if you're just in the room, but your heart is not here now to love God, then it's all a waste. I think many of us are exhausted and we're isolated because we are distracted. And for some, we're distracted by horrific things. But for some, we're distracted by really good things. Really good things, really good opportunities. Great ways to make money or to serve the Lord or to help other people, really good things. And yet, in just a little nuanced way, instead of doing these in response to who God is, maybe we're doing them trying to make ourselves look a little bit better, be a little bit better, get a little bit closer to God, be a little bit more secure in who we are. And in that little nuance of rebellion, we have jumped on a treadmill that's exhausting. And as that exhaustion builds up, we begin to feel all alone. And God is calling our attention today back to Him, to see Him, to focus on Him. You know why I love Jesus? Martha, in her own opinion, had messed up at the grave of Lazarus. And now, in order to get it right, she had messed up trying to get it right. And yet Jesus, unchanging, always loving Jesus, keeps on inviting her back, keeps on calling her back, keeps on asking her to find a better way, a way that is found in Him. That's good news for us today. Because I don't know every time you've screwed up, but for a lot of you, I know some of them. And you don't know every time I've screwed up, but you know a lot of them. And Jesus just keeps on inviting us back, keeps on redirecting us, knowing that eventually we're going to trust Him. Eventually our eyes are going to see it all. But between now and then, He's going to keep on in compassion saying, "You're anxious and troubled. Come back to me." That's what we can do today. Would you bow your heads in prayer?